Before we started looking at different groups in Jewish society, we looked at the Pharisees and saw that the purpose of the Pharisees was to make the law of Moses basically practical, to figure out how it applied in everyday life. But they ultimately ended up doing that by adding a whole bunch of extra rules to it, so that by following their extra rules, you could be absolutely certain that you never broke any of the law of Moses. But, of course, it was those extra rules that Jesus criticized them for. They were adding things to the law. And we looked at the Sadducees, which was more of a aristocratic group that was focused more on the temple. And they didn't accept a lot of the same things the Pharisees did. They didn't believe in things like the afterlife or angels, or the authority of a lot of the Old Testament. They really probably only accepted the first 5 books. And so there was a lot of conflict between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And the last group we finished up with were the scribes, which were sort of the intelligentsia. They were mainly Pharisees, but the scribes were the one who really knew the law and taught it to the people. And because of that, it was the Pharisees, that more version of Judaism, that more or less survived. The Sadducees died out, but the Pharisees pretty much survived into the present day. Modern day Judaism is essentially Pharisaical Judaism. And that's where we ended last time. So any questions before we go on? All right, so the next 2 groups we're going to look at aren't mentioned by name in the New Testament, but they were both very important groups for that time period and to really understand the history of what was going on then. So the first of those groups are the Zealots. And the Zealots were not a single monolithic group. Rather, the Zealots were kind of a loose association of a lot of different groups that were all very militant anti-Roman parties that were dedicated to undermining and ultimately overthrowing Roman rule. So these were, again, various sort of loosely associated groups, but all with the intent of overthrowing the Romans. Now, legendarily, the group was founded by a man named Judas the Galilean, who may have organized a rebellion against the Romans in 86. Though we're not, again, a lot of this is more legendary. And it's possible that even though they attribute this 86 rebellion to the start of the Zealots, the group might not have really been organized until much later. So it's somewhat questionable as to whether or not there was a group called the Zealots during Jesus' time, or whether they really became organized after his time. But the Zealots sort of modeled themselves after Judas Maccabee, who, remember, Judas Maccabee was the one who retook the temple from the Greeks. And that he was very much sort of their model as to how to go about to overthrow the Romans. And some of the Zealots were very religious, and some of them had a more secular orientation. Most of them did look for a Messiah, but very much a militaristic Messiah. They were looking for a Messiah who would come in and overthrow the Romans and rule over an independent Jewish state. The Zealots avoided paying taxes, if at all possible. And they, in fact, a lot of times would harass people who they saw as cooperating with the Romans. And sometimes that would be active collaborators like tax collectors. Sometimes they saw anyone who wasn't actively resisting the Romans as legitimate targets. And some of the Zealots were so extreme that they refused to even touch coins that had the emperor's image on them, which again, all the official Roman coins had the picture of the emperor. Now, this is why it was such a big deal when Jesus was asked about paying taxes to Caesar, because the Pharisees were really trying to set him up to either align himself for or against these zealot groups. And of course, Jesus found a way of not really aligning himself either way, because that wasn't his purpose. Now, a lot of these zealot groups hid out in caves in the desert and the wilderness, and they more or less acted like bandits. In fact, a lot of them would claim to have these grandiose ambitions of overthrowing the Romans, but in day-to-day life, they really just acted like bandits, and the Romans more or less treated them as such. They recruited mainly from the other rural peasants, the people, who were most oppressed by the Romans. And they would stage hit-and-run raids on Romans and on Roman sympathizers, on things like merchant caravans, again, that were passing through. And so, again, they're really acting more like bandits than any kind of organized military resistance. And sometimes this would draw Roman retaliation. If they hit, for example, a Roman caravan or a group of Roman soldiers, the Romans would retaliate oftentimes not by going after the Zealots directly, but by hitting local villages. So that way they could, take out the people who are the most likely to join the Zealots, and also, turn the local populace against them. Basically, with the idea of, if you're angry at us, be angry at the Zealots. They're the reasons we're attacking you. So a lot of the Jews, even though they may not have been happy with the Romans, weren't particularly happy with the Zealot groups either. The Zealots even had a sort of secret terrorist wing called the Sicarii, Sicarii, and these were actually people who would carry out assassinations against local Roman officials and against people like tax collectors. So they were really bandits and terrorists in a lot of ways. And there were Pharisees, particularly the Shammaites, which were the extreme branch of the Pharisees, who secretly supported the Zealots and might have even helped to fund them. Now, of course, in terms of the New Testament, the one direct mention we have of the Zealots is Simon the Zealot, who was one of the apostles of Jesus. Now, there is some debate as to what exactly it meant that he was called Simon the Zealot, because, again, some scholars say that the Zealots weren't even an organized group in Jesus' time, and that the word zealot there could have meant that he was zealous for the law or zealous for the temple, or it could just be a mistranslation, that maybe that the word we're translating zealot doesn't mean that at all, that it may have just been referring to something like his hometown. It's hard to say, because other than that he was a zealot, whatever that means, we know pretty much nothing else about Simon the Zealot. He has to be like the most obscure of the 12 apostles. I mean, literally nothing else about the man. So it's kind of hard to say exactly what kind of zealot he was. But the Zealots would become very important during the decades after Jesus, and very much so leading up to the Jewish rebellion and the Jewish wars that would eventually result in the destruction of the temple. And again, that's something we'll look at the end of the course. So the last of these major Jewish groups that we're going to look at, again, is not a group that's mentioned by name in the New Testament, but is very important for Christian and New Testament history, and that is the Essenes. Now, the Essenes, again, probably weren't a completely unified group either. They were sort of a diverse group of exclusivist communities. So these were people who withdrew from mainstream Jewish societies and went off to live in the desert, mainly on the west bank of the Dead Sea. And, this was not a pleasant place to live. The Dead Sea is only about 20 miles east of Jerusalem, but average summertime temperatures there hover around 100 degrees, and the area gets less than 2 inches of rainfall per year. So this is very much a desert area that they moved out into. However, the Essenes were able to survive there by building aqueducts that actually channeled fresh water from the surrounding hills down into their pools and cisterns. So they were able to bring water in to be able to survive. But the Essenes moved out into the desert like this because they absolutely opposed the Jewish religious establishment, particularly the Sadducees, which they refer to as the wicked priests. And, they were very religious Jews, but they very much opposed the current religious establishment. Rather, they were an apocalyptic sect. They called themselves the Yahad, or the community of the elect. So they saw themselves as being the people of a new covenant and as the only true Jews. They believed that their group was the fulfillment of end-time prophecies in the Hebrew Scriptures. They saw themselves as the, quote, sons of light. And again, all the other Jews, not to mention the Gentiles, were sons of darkness. Basically, they were very tight-knit. They loved each other dearly and hated everybody else. So they saw themselves as the only true Jews, the only true people of God. And so they retreated into the desert to prepare a way for the Lord and to separate themselves from mainstream society. So this is somewhat similar to the monastic communities that would come later in medieval Christianity. But they believed that on the day of the Lord, when the Messiah came and everything was put right, that they would be the new priests in a restored Israel. That the Messiah would come, he would clean out all the wicked Jewish establishment and install them as the true priests. And to symbolize this, they all wore white robes. So, they're a very visually distinct group. Now, they were very much an ascetic movement, meaning that they denied themselves worldly pleasures. And they practiced very, very strict discipline. In fact, a lot of what we know about the Essenes comes from their manual of discipline, which was discovered in these caves. And so from that manual, we know that prospective members, if you wanted to join the Essenes, you had to undergo a 3-year probationary period. So you had to be trained and follow their rules for 3 years before they'd let you in. Once you were accepted into the community, you sold all of your possessions and gave all the money you got into the common treasury. So it was very much no Essene individually owned anything. It was all, held in common by, and distributed by the leaders of the group. Already starting to sound like a cult. They held all their goods in common. They maintained a very Spartan lifestyle with a very strict diet. So again, very ascetic, very much denying themselves any kind of worldly pleasure. They very much emphasized the Jewish laws of ceremonial purity. And like the Pharisees, went way beyond what the Mosaic law called for, including things like daily ritual baths. Now, there was a lot of ritual bathing that the Jews had to go through for the different feasts and at different times, but the Essenes did it daily to keep themselves ritually pure. They prayed at sunrise. They had communal worship. They practiced sexual abstinence and discouraged members from marrying, though they weren't forbidden to marry. But even if they were married, they were still expected to be abstinent because, they believed they were holding themselves apart to be pure priests. Again, this is far beyond anything the Mosaic law required. Their compounds, their, communities out in the caves, they were off limits to anyone who was blind, deaf, or lame, because these were symbols of impurity. In the Old Testament, it's like the sacrifices had to be perfect in the same way that people The Essenes expected people to be physically perfect, that there could be no impurity. Anyone who was caught spitting, talking out of turn, or laughing loudly had his food cut.
No, for my lunch.
Yeah. And anyone who violated these rules were to be judged by a tribunal of 100 people, 100 of the leaders, who could impose a death sentence. Again, remember, this is a very isolated group. There were no Romans there to tell them what they could and couldn't do. So they were able to impose the death sentence on members who they felt had gone too far out of line. So since they were an apocalyptic cult, they had a very strong eschatological orientation. Remember, eschatological means referring to the end of things, referring to the end times. They believed they were living in the last days, and they were awaiting a day of the Lord, as was foretold by the prophets, in which Israel would be spiritually revived around a new Jerusalem, and where, again, they would be the leaders. They would be the priests. Another of their writings was called the War Scroll, or a longer name, the War of the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness. And this predicted a great battle in which the Messiah would kill the Roman emperor. Interestingly, there were actually Essenes who were pacifists, but most believed that they would be fighting alongside the Messiah. Now, this kind of eschatological bent was not unique to them. There were a lot of Jews at the time who very much believed that the day of the Lord was at hand. In fact, one of the most popular books at the time was what's called the Book of Enoch. Not actually written by Enoch, but, And part of the Book of Enoch was a prediction of this final day of the Lord and of how God would come and smite his enemies. And the Essenes had a very high regard for the Book of Enoch. So they believed that 4 important people would come and contribute to the restoration of Israel. The first was a person called the teacher of righteousness. And the teacher of righteousness was actually the founder of their order, the man who started the Essenes. And he taught, to justify all of this, he taught the Essenes a very sort of metaphorical, mystical, esoteric way of interpreting the scriptures. So they did not read the scriptures the same way that ordinary Jews did. They had a very, mystical interpretation of it. And, according to the text left behind by the Essenes, this teacher of righteousness founded their order around 165 BC, and he was persecuted by the Sadducees. Again, how accurate that is kind of hard to say. But that's according to their writings. So they believed he was the first sort of person to come and start this restoration. There would also be 2 messiahs. There would be, quote, a Messiah of Israel, and the Messiah of Israel was the kingly figure coming from the line of David, and he would be the political Messiah. He was the one who believed would come in and drive out the Romans and usher in a new age. But they also believed there was what they called a Messiah of Aaron. And the Messiah of Aaron was a priestly Messiah who would come in and purify the religious life. So you had a political Messiah who would drive out the Romans and create a new Jewish state. Then there was a religious Messiah who would come and purify the people. And you could almost say that, to some extent, they were reading the prophecies correctly. They saw that there would be these 2 kinds of Messiah. They just didn't realize they'd be united in one person. And then finally, they were waiting for the prophet that Moses foretold in Deuteronomy 18:15 through 18. And in Deuteronomy, Moses said, "The Lord God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own brothers. You must listen to him. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will tell them everything I command him." And ultimately, we believe that this was fulfilled in Jesus. And in fact, a lot of the Jews, you'll find references to this prophecy in the New Testament in relation to Jesus. So the Jews of that time, were seeing Jesus as a possible fulfillment of this. So these are the four people that, according to the Essenes, were going to come and bring about the end of days and the restoration of Israel. So this was never a large group. The Essenes probably at their largest numbered around 4,000 people. But they're very, very important for Christian history for a couple of reasons. One, there are some scholars who will claim that John the Baptist was an Essene. I don't buy that. He's not described as that in scriptures. Even though there's some overlap in their teaching, he doesn't seem to fit that mold. But the bigger reason they're important is because the Essenes are the people who produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. One of their communities was at Qumran, which is where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. And most likely, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, if you don't know, they're a collection of Jewish manuscripts containing most of the Old Testament and a lot of extra writings as well. So you have, they had made copies of most of the Old Testament. They had copies of their own books, like we've discussed, which are part of the Dead Sea Scrolls. There were books like the Book of Enoch and other apocryphal writings there, and a bunch of others that the Essenes preserved in their community in Qumran, and they were discovered in the 1940s. But that's probably their biggest contribution to Christian and Jewish history, was they were the group that actually preserved the manuscripts that later on will be found and called the Dead Sea Scrolls.
And the significance of those?
There's a lot of significance. For one, it gives us our earliest manuscripts of the Old Testament by like 1,000 years. Some of the manuscripts are nearly complete. Like we have a nearly complete copy of Isaiah. That's the biggest one. There are a lot of that are, significant portions of books, like the Dead Sea Scrolls contain a significant portion of the book of Jeremiah. There are a lot of other fragments. So, they're the earliest Old Testament manuscripts we have, and they do give us a lot of information on just what was going on in Judea at the time as well. So they're historically significant and significant in terms of biblical manuscripts.
Were they also significant because they were the first time we found something that was before Jesus?
Yeah, they're the oldest. They're the oldest biblical manuscripts.
But until we found those, we didn't have anything that predated Jesus that predicted Jesus.
I don't think there was any doubt about the fact that the Old Testament was older than Jesus, but those were the first times we had any actual manuscripts that predated Jesus. Any other questions?
So if those weren't found until the 1940s, then the Old Testament scriptures that we have and the other scriptures, were those just mostly from oral?
No, this I go into this in a lot of detail in the bibliology class, which all the recordings of that are online, so you can listen to it. But basically, we had the basis of our Old Testament text. Now, New Testament's a completely different thing. But the basis of our Old Testament text comes from medieval Jewish scribes that developed systems to copy their manuscripts very, very precisely. So they kept a very accurate copies of the Old Testament. But, those, again, were from like the 900s, the 1000s. And so finding the Dead Sea Scrolls was the first time we had Old Testament manuscripts from before the time of Jesus. But, and they line up for the most part very well. The Dead Sea Scrolls give us a lot of confidence that the medieval Jewish scribes were doing a good job of keeping things accurate. But no, the Old Testament had been written down long before. It wasn't oral transmission. It's just that all the manuscripts that had been produced before around the 900s, we just didn't have anymore. But they were keeping manuscripts continuously. It was never oral tradition.
We had copies of copies of copies.
Yeah.
We just didn't have the originals or the copies of the originals.
And we still don't. But the Dead Sea Scrolls puts us a lot closer to the originals of the Old Testament than we were before.
So, Eric, you're saying that they were more or less a confirmation of what we already had?
Yeah, I mean, and they line up. Some of it lines up really well. Like the Isaiah scroll is like 95, 99% exactly the same as what we have now, and the differences are things like spelling. Others, like the Jeremiah scroll, did have some significant differences. But we don't know exactly, why that is. And, we still tend to trust that the medieval text is called the Masoretic text more because the Dead Sea Scrolls are older, but they're also the product of a very isolated community, and we only have a few copies. Whereas the Masoretic text is later, but we have we have more copies of it, and they're the product of a very long tradition. It gets complicated. I mean, it really does. I mean, just biblical textual criticism, it has to deal with a lot of different questions. But for the most part, it shows that our copies of the Old Testament, were for the most part accurate. I mean, there weren't any major differences. Anything else? Okay, so these were some of the main groups that were, around Jews at the time. Now, we've been talking about more or less groups that were in Judea, but in fact, most Jews at the time did not live in Judea or Galilee. They were actually scattered over most of the Roman Empire in what's called the diaspora. And the diaspora basically just means the scattering. So you had very diverse communities of Jews throughout the entire known world at the time. So in the few centuries before Christ, Jews had been scattered throughout the Middle East and into the greater Mediterranean region. So into North Africa, into Europe, even, and there were still Jewish communities in places like Mesopotamia that had been there since the days of the exile. So the Jews were very much scattered. Some Jews, possibly the majority of Jews, had never returned to Israel from the exile. So there are numerous communities of Jews throughout Mesopotamia and Persia, which were not part of the Roman Empire. And then after the time of Alexander the Great, you had a lot of Jews migrating through the Hellenistic world, which was like the Middle East, Greece, North Africa, all of that. And this is because you have people like merchants and farmers and government officials who just sort of spread out. Other Jews have been conscripted into the Greek armies, and a lot of times those never returned either. They just sort of ended up settling wherever they went. And after Pompey, the Roman general, conquered Israel, thousands of Jews were enslaved because that was the standard Roman practice. You went and conquered some people, you enslaved part of their people, you take them back to Rome or other cities and towns throughout the empire. So you had all of these different factors that went into just scattering the Jews everywhere. So by the time of Christ, there were probably less than 1.5 million Jews actually in Judea and Galilee. And probably about 4 to 5 million others outside. So again, the vast majority of Jews were living outside of Judea. They were mostly Greek speaking. They didn't speak Aramaic. They didn't share the same culture as the Jews that were left behind in Judea and Galilee. In fact, there were about 30 to 50,000 Jews in Rome. And at the time of Christ, there were probably about a dozen or so Jewish synagogues in Rome. Interestingly, one of the Roman emperors a few decades later would actually issue an order to send all the Jews out of Rome. But during the time of Christ, there was a significant Jewish presence in Rome. There were probably also as many as 750,000 living in Egypt, mainly Alexandria. Alexandria had a very large Jewish community. In fact, Alexandria, in a lot of ways, was more prominent in the Jewish world than even something like Jerusalem. Jerusalem had the temple and all that, but Alexandria was where you had a huge number of Jews and a lot of the Jewish intelligentsia, a lot of Jewish philosophers and thinkers were in Alexandria. And Alexandria, if you don't know, is a city in Egypt. And these communities were very, very diverse. In fact, a lot of these Jews abandoned Judaism. They abandoned traditional Jewish religion. They intermarried with the Gentiles, and they just completely assimilated into Hellenistic culture, to the point where, eventually they just wouldn't have even thought of themselves as Jews anymore. They just completely assimilated. Others took Judaism and being Jews far more seriously. They held on much more tightly to the worship of Yahweh, to the Mosaic law, and they worked to maintain their distinctives. Someone like... Yeah, and you look at someone like Paul, who came from the Roman city of Tarsus, which was in what is now southern Turkey. Tarsus was very much a Roman city, but he would have grown up as a very observant religious Jew. So there were Jews that still very much kept their Jewishness. And they occupied all the different stratuses of society. There were Jews who were, very wealthy. They were traders, they were artisans, they were magistrates. Others were slaves. So you had Jews all over the known world in a whole spectrum of Jewishness, a whole spectrum of prosperity. And there were some who even earned Roman citizenship. Again, the Apostle Paul, who was probably born into a family of Roman citizens. He probably didn't pursue it himself. Most likely his father was a Roman citizen. And even though he was also clearly a very strict Jew. Now, the other people around, the Romans and the Greeks who were sort of sharing these cities with the Jews, some would have very mixed feelings about them, the ones that remained Jews. Some of them considered them to be rather quaint. Some of them saw them as very self-righteous and very standoffish. And a lot of the Romans and Greeks resented the Jews because they held themselves apart, because they had a unique lifestyle. They had these strict dietary rules, and they had a very exclusive religion. Roman religion, and we'll discuss Roman religion in detail later, but Roman religion was very inclusive, and the Romans and the Jews are very exclusive. And so the Romans and the Greeks saw them as being very, very standoffish, and that tends to lead to resentment. Furthermore, Jews, the religious Jews, continued to circumcise their male children, and pretty much everyone else in Hellenistic society saw that as incredibly barbaric. So that was seen as a horrific practice to non-Jewish people. And of course, the religious Jews held to the Sabbath and refused to work on the Sabbath, which caused problems. So there was a lot of resentment, a lot of bad feelings toward the Jews, a lot of prejudice. But there were some Gentiles who had a lot of respect for them. They respected the Jews for having a very ancient religion. The Romans respected things that were old. And they knew the Jewish religion was very old, and that gained them some respect. They admired their strict moral values, even though they didn't share them themselves. The Jews are very devoted to marriage and family, and that was seen as a good thing. They were sexually disciplined, which could be respected, even though, again, it was seen as somewhat suspicious. And they were charitable. And they also placed a great emphasis on education, which of course they still do. And this was seen, especially by the Greeks, as a very respectable thing. So attitudes towards the Jews were very, very mixed. In the words of the historian Thomas Cahill, and Cahill, not a Christian as far as I know, but wrote two very good books on the subject. He wrote a book called The Gift of the Jews, about the Jews mainly during the Old Testament, and he wrote a book called The Desire of the Everlasting Hills about the early church, both of which I would highly recommend. Excellent books. But he wrote, in the cities of the diaspora, especially Alexandria, Antioch, Ephesus, and Rome, Jews were widely admired by their Gentile neighbors. For one thing, they had a real religion, not a cluster of gods and goddesses and pro forma rituals that almost nobody took seriously anymore. They actually believed in their one God, and they even set aside one day a week to pray to him and reflect on their lives. They possessed a dignified library of sacred books that they studied reverently as part of this weekly reflection, and which pointed toward a consistent worldview. Furthermore, Jewish men were faithful spouses who maintained strong families in which even grown children remained effectively attached and respectful to their parents. Despite their growing economic success, they tended to be more scrupulous in business than non-Jews. And they were downright finicky when it came to taking human life, seeming to value even a slave's or a plebeian's life as much as anyone else's. Perhaps in nothing did the Gentiles find the Jews so admirable as in their acts of charity. Communities of urban Jews, in addition to opening synagogues, built welfare centers for aiding the poor, the miserable, the sick, the imprisoned, and those such as widows and orphans who had no family to care for them. And again, that's from The Desire of the Everlasting Hills, Thomas Cahill. So because there was a certain amount of respect to the Jews, and usually in these Jewish communities, you would also find a significant number of Gentiles who had converted to Judaism. Now, some of these Gentiles were what are called proselytes. And proselytes were men and women who had formally converted. They had sort of gone all the way, which meant that they were baptized. If they were male, they were circumcised. Ouch. They observed all the laws and the traditions of the Jewish faith, and they became members of local synagogues. So proselytes were Gentiles who fully converted to Judaism. But most of the Gentiles who sort of leaned that way didn't become full-on proselytes. Rather, they became what were called God-fearers. And you hear mention of these in the New Testament. They'll talk about people like Cornelius, the centurion, was a God-fearer. And this was a Gentile who had more of a casual identification with Judaism. They accepted Jewish beliefs. They tried to follow Jewish morality. They would abstain from idolatry. A lot of times they would keep kosher. They would refrain from working on the Sabbath. And a lot of times they would contribute financially to local synagogues. But, they didn't go all the way into becoming full-fledged Jews. Not surprisingly, because of the whole circumcision thing, women were more likely to become full-fledged proselytes than men. But again, God-fearers, you find lots of mention of God-fearing Gentiles in the New Testament, both in the Gospels and in the book of Acts. And that's what they're talking about. They're Gentiles who really lived like Jews but didn't go full-fledged into becoming Jews. Again, to quote Cahill in The Desire of the Everlasting Hills, he said, "The diaspora cities of the first century saw a marked increase in Gentile initiates to Judaism. Many of these were well-born women who presided over substantial households and who had likely tried out some of the Eastern mystery cults before settling on Judaism." And we'll talk about the mystery cults later. These Gentiles did not, generally speaking, go all the way. They tended to draw the line at circumcision. Jews referred to these people as God-fearers, Gentiles who kept the Sabbath, observed Jewish dietary laws, and put their faith in the God of the Jews. So, by the time of Jesus, being a Jew really didn't necessarily mean the same thing to everyone. And you could be a Jew in, for example, Alexandria and be very different in culture and background than a Jew in Judea, even if you still held to the Jewish religion. Even the names are different. One of the best arguments for the accuracy of the New Testament that have been put forth recently is to show that the names in the New Testament correspond to names used by Jews in Judea and Galilee in the first century, even down to how often those names are used. Because if you compare the names of Jews in Judea, they're very different from even the names of Jews in places like Alexandria. So they could have a very different culture, but still be Jews. And this is why you had the disciples using the gift of tongues, at Pentecost. They weren't so much speaking to Gentiles, they were speaking to Jews who had come in from all over the world to Jerusalem, many of whom only spoke their own language. Now, probably the most important contribution of the diaspora to Jewish religion was the translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, into Greek, which we call the Septuagint. So the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and there is a legend about how it was actually done. The legend of the Septuagint comes from a document called the Letter of Aristeas, or the Letter to Philocrates. And this letter tells the story that the Septuagint was produced in the 3rd century BC when Ptolemy II commissioned 72 Jewish scholars from Jerusalem to come to Alexandria and produce a Greek version of the Pentateuch. Supposedly this was done because you had the great library at Alexandria that theoretically had a copy of every book ever written in the entire world. Or at least they believed they had a copy of every important work ever written. So after the Greek conquest of the Jews, they wanted a Greek copy of the Jewish scriptures for the library. So again, according to this legend, the Greek king commissioned 72 Jewish scholars from Jerusalem to come and produce a Greek version of the Pentateuch. Now, supposedly, these 72 scholars included 6 representatives from each of the 12 tribes who were chosen by the high priest. And here's where the legend gets a bit much to believe. According to the legend, each of the 72 scholars worked independently to produce a Greek translation of the Pentateuch. If you know how translation works, that's not how translation works. You work in teams, almost always. But according to the legend, they all worked independently, but when they all came back to compare their translations, lo and behold, they all produced the exact same thing. So that's the myth. Again, probably not accurate, but it does show the very high regard that the Jewish community of the first century put the Septuagint in. In another version of the legend, the whole project was finished in 72 days. So according to this letter, it says, King Ptolemy once gathered 72 elders. He placed them in 72 chambers, each of them in a separate one, without revealing to them why they were summoned. He entered each one's room and said, "Write to me the Torah of Moshe, your leader." God put it in the heart of each one to translate identically as all the others did. And this legend, helps explain why a lot of Jews actually believe that the Septuagint was divinely inspired, that this was a divinely inspired Greek translation. And in fact, there were some, and you'll still find people who argue this today, who claim that the Septuagint was more inspired than the original, that it corrected mistakes. Now, this was just the original Pentateuch. This was the first 5 books. Over the next couple of centuries, the rest of the Jewish scriptures would get translated. So it wasn't a come together and do it all at once. This was a long process of sort of slowly bit by bit translating the Old Testament into Greek. It's not, really clear when each book was translated. It's quite possible that there are several books that were translated more than once. And so you had multiple Greek versions that, some of them just proved more popular than others. Also, the style was very different. Some books of the Septuagint are very, very, very close. They're almost like word-for-word translations from the Hebrew. Others are closer to being paraphrases. They were very free translations. And so there's a wide variety of style and translation philosophy throughout the Septuagint. But, and in fact, there was never a standard text. There was never a standard Septuagint. And we see this because the Gospels and the early church fathers, the people who wrote right after the apostles, quoted the Septuagint all the time. Most of the Old Testament translations in the Gospels are straight out of the Septuagint. But a lot of times you would have multiple people quoting the Septuagint, but quoting it differently. So there does appear that there was never a single standard Septuagint. Now, the order of books in the Septuagint became the model for the earliest Christian Bibles. Our own order for the Old Testament follows much more closely after the Septuagint than the way the Jews have it. The Jews have all the same books we do, but they're arranged very differently. We get our order more or less from the Septuagint. Also, in the originals, the books of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles are single works. You have a book of Samuel, a book of Kings, a book of Chronicles. It was the Septuagint that first divided them up into 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So that's how Christian Bibles have them today. Again, Jewish Bibles, Hebrew Bibles, tend to keep them as single books. Now, there were also books eventually ended up included in the Septuagint that were never part of the Old Testament. You have books like Tobit, Judith, the Wisdom of Solomon, Ecclesiasticus or Ben Sirach, Baruch, Letter of Jeremiah, additions to Daniel, additions to Esther. So the Septuagint versions of Daniel and Esther are longer than the versions we have in our Bibles. They contain more information because they were added, and others. So these books that were included along with the Septuagint, as far as we can tell, the Jews never accepted them as scripture. They were just sort of lumped in with the other Greek translations. But because the Septuagint became the Bible of the early church, because the early church was much more Greek-speaking than Hebrew-speaking, the Septuagint was the Bible of the early church. That led to a lot of the early church accepting these extra books as scripture. And it would take a couple centuries before they finally sort of worked out that, maybe these are sort of separate. But these extra books, they are what end up being the Apocrypha. These extra books that were included in the Septuagint, but were never part of the Jewish New Testament, or Old Jewish scriptures. They're what we nowadays call the Apocrypha. And again, they're included in Roman Catholic Bibles and Orthodox Bibles and some others, but not in Protestant Bibles. And even like the Roman Catholics and the Orthodox and others don't all have the same apocryphal books. They all include some, don't include others. But we can trace that sort of confusion back to the Septuagint. Interestingly, the word Septuagint, the word sept means 70. And so the Septuagint goes back to this idea of there being 70 or 72 scholars. But we don't have any record of it actually being called the Septuagint until the time of Augustus, or Augustine. Augustine, who was a famous Christian philosopher and thinker, lived in the late 300s, early 400s. And he's the first record we have of the Greek Old Testament actually being called the Septuagint. Before that, it just would have been considered the Greek translation of the Jewish scriptures. And again, it was the Bible of the early church.
When did they start calling it the Bible?
Oh, Bible comes from Latin biblios, which means books. I don't think that would have come about until probably the medieval period. But I'm not sure exactly when it sort of got the overall name of Bible.
So it was called Scriptures before?
Well, the Old Testament, the Jews called the Tanakh, which is actually an acronym. There are 3 divisions to the Jewish scriptures. They have the law, the prophets, and the writings. There's the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, literally law, prophets, and writings. And you take those first 3 letters, T, N, and K, you get Tanakh. So the Old Testament, the Jews still call it the Tanakh, and that's what it would have been called then when they didn't just call it the law and the prophets. And of course, the idea of the New Testament, that just would have been referred to as the Scriptures. Just they would have been lumped in. You have had the Old and the New Testament together, referred to by Christians as the Scriptures. Yeah, I don't know when we started calling it Bible, which derives from books. I mean, when you call it the Bible, you're literally calling it the books. I don't remember exactly when that word came into common use.
Around the 4th century.
Okay.
In the writings of John
Chrysostom? Yeah. So later. Any other questions? Okay, well, this is a good stopping point. This is a good break. Next time, we'll start looking at some of the major Jewish institutions. We'll look at the Sanhedrin. We'll look at the temple. We'll look at how synagogues worked and some things like that.